Yeah, absolutely. Let me make sure I share my screen appropriately. Hopefully everyone's looking at the title slide. If not, let me know. But as Venus mentioned, we have our FAA Drone Symposium and AAM Summit coming up. I bet you one of the big topics we're going to have to discuss is remote ID, being that the symposium is going to be just about 5 weeks or so away from the compliance date. So what I wanted to do here with all of you is just walk through a bit of a refresher on remote ID, and then get into a little bit of FRIAs, talking about what they are, how do you get them, what they're not, and where we're at currently with FRIA application approvals. Now, that being said, I know our Q&A is open. I don't think the chat is, but the Q&A is, and I'm not going to pretend to be the smartest person in the room. We have some folks here that are on our call from the FAA that are experts in specific operations when it comes to remote ID and FRIAs. So if you have a really good question, send it in. They'll take a look at the question. If it's very technical or nuanced, they'll probably get it to one of our experts on the panel. If it's something that's maybe more globally, can apply to everyone, then I'll read it on the air and I'll take my shot at it, or I'll bring one of our experts on to answer the question. So let's get going here. Just quickly talking about some dates. Most of these are in the past. We're really coming up to the very last date on there, which is September 16th, 2023. That is going to be what we call the operational compliance date for remote ID. In other words, anybody flying a drone that's required to be equipped with remote ID must equip their drone, start broadcasting with that equipment on September 16th, with few exceptions, in order to keep flying. So we've moved through sort of all these benchmark dates when it comes to remote ID, and now we're getting into, well, really the compliance date. So why are we doing this? Well, if you haven't had a chance to read through the final remote ID rule in the preamble, don't blame you. There's quite a few pages there. But really what we're looking at doing is keeping our national airspace system safe and secure. But it's also really about building this up, where we're trying to get to. We've done a fairly decent job. I'll take the criticism here or there of integrating drones safely into our national airspace system, or NAS, but we need to keep going forward. You know, when you talk about things like routine package delivery or normalizing beyond visual line of sight flying, that's not going to happen without the ability to ensure the safety, security, and efficiency of our airspace system. So really, remote ID is just this next incremental step towards the future integration of drones. Whether you like the description or not, you saw it in that video, but remote ID in a lot of ways can be thought of as a digital license plate for your drone. I've heard a lot of people that don't like that. I think in terms of explaining how the concept of remote ID works, it's pretty good. So who needs this? Who needs this digital license plate? Well, in the simplest way, if your drone requires FAA registration, I'm very careful to say FAA registration because there are some states that require different registrations for drones and aircraft. But if it requires FAA registration, then you're going to need to equip that drone with remote ID. So then the question begs, which drones require FAA registration? Well, if you're flying a drone under Part 107, the answer is easy. It's every one of them. The minimum weight limits, all that stuff, does not apply for drones being flown under Part 107. So if you're flying under Part 107, your drone needs to be individually registered, which also means it needs to have its individual remote ID serial number attached to it. So it's kind of a 1-to-1 ratio. If you have one drone, it's one registration number, one remote ID serial number. If you have two drones, it's two of everything. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. For the recreational flyers, either the Section 44809 people, which do include a lot of educational institutions, if that drone weighs more than 0.55 pounds, about 250 grams, then it requires registration. That's probably not news to anyone here, but since it requires registration, it will also require remote ID. Now, there's some differences with 44809 registrations, meaning that it's not really a 1-to-1 ratio. If you've flown under 44809, if you're flown as a rec flyer, you know that your one registration number is valid for all those drones. Remote ID will work somewhat similar to that. There are some nuances we'll talk about, but essentially it's a one-to-many. And most of the time with recreationally flown drones, we'll be talking about broadcast modules. So we'll get into that a little bit later. But that's where the registration requirement drives the remote ID equipment requirement. So kind of keep that understanding here as we move through the rest of the presentation. Now, when we get into equipping with remote ID or complying with the rule, there's really 3 ways to do it. That's going to be what we call a standard remote ID drone. This is a drone that's created, manufactured with remote ID capabilities baked into it, if you will, or built into the drone itself. That's a standard remote ID. So those drones that you're buying off the shelf, if they don't have it now, production cycles, you'll eventually, all those drones will be having standard remote ID. The other option is you have a drone now or a drone that's not remote ID compliant, or you build drones. Their option to comply is done probably through a broadcast module, which think of it as an aftermarket attachment add-on, or you can fly in, which we're going to talk a lot about here in just a few minutes, an FAA recognized identification area. I know that's at the top of a lot of your minds, so I promise we're going to get to that. So let me just break it down a little bit further so we have an understanding of what we're talking about here. A standard remote ID drones, like I mentioned, are built by a manufacturer with remote ID equipment baked into the drone, if you will. It's not an add-on component. It's just you buy the drone, it has remote ID built into it. The message elements, so what a remote ID, a piece of equipment, whether it's a broadcast module or a standard remote ID, are pretty similar. There's a couple of differences here. So I'm going to point those out. For one, with standard remote ID, it's going to broadcast not only where the drone is, but it'll broadcast where the control station is. So wherever the person is holding the control station, that location will also be broadcast through the remote ID information distribution. It also has an emergency status associated with it as well. When you're operating a standard remote ID drone, other than the rules themselves, so Part 107 or perhaps 44809, there's no additional requirements that you need to comply with. So it's if you're flying a standard remote ID drone, you can operate beyond visual line of sight with the appropriate waivers. You can operate over people with the appropriate authorizations, all that type of stuff. There's no associated additional operating limitations through a standard remote ID drone. A little bit different for the aftermarket add-on or the broadcast module. These are ones you can purchase separately, add to your drone. They're really designed so that the thousands, hundreds of thousands, dare I say, or millions of drones maybe that be out there in the US don't turn into paperweights. So remote ID broadcast modules is there to help solve that issue. You'll notice some slight differences in the broadcast elements. We don't broadcast where the control station is for a broadcast module, but it will note the takeoff location of the drone. All things being equal, I'd like to think that the drone is taking off somewhere near you so that you can see it before it goes up and identify any hazards that might be in the area. But nonetheless, it's not going to broadcast where that control station is. It'll just say that's where the drone took off. And you can see there's no emergency status notification. One thing, though, in italics at the bottom, you'll note that with broadcast modules, it has to be flown within visual line of sight. That's a requirement with the broadcast module. That's a little bit different than standard remote ID drones. So just a couple of differences there. Now, what if you don't have a standard remote ID drone, or you don't have one, can't purchase, it's not realistic, can't find them broadcast modules? Well, the third option is FAA recognized identification areas, which I'm going to just shorten up and say FRIAs because that's just way easier for me here on a Tuesday afternoon. FRIAs are, in all essence, a two-dimensional location. And I emphasize that because they're different than fixed flying sites. We're going to get into a little bit of that later, but it's a two-dimensional location. This is a location that's on the ground. When you do apply for a FRIA, and if it's approved, that approval will be valid for 48 months, unless you renew it for longer, or you tell us you don't want it anymore, or the FAA has some other reason that we need to take it back or not allow that FRIA location to exist. We can terminate that, you can terminate that, but generally speaking, they'll last for 48 months. But again, two-dimensional location. Now, checking to see if your drone is already remote ID compliant, or a drone that you want to buy is remote ID compliant. Footnote, don't rely on packaging or marketing to try to sell you a drone that says, hey, this one's remote ID compliant. Always check. And the way you can check is our Declaration of Compliance website. What this website does is it lists all the drones that the FAA has accepted as being in compliance and all the broadcast modules that the FAA has accepted as being in compliance with the remote ID broadcast requirements. So not getting it too technical on it, but anything that's on our declaration of compliance list on our website, we can post that link into the chat, give you that link later. Anything that's listed on there, we have determined has met the means of compliance requirements, and we've accepted the declaration of compliance that this drone or this broadcast module is remote ID compliant. Now, to be completely transparent, it's not the easiest website to navigate. I know this. This is something that the team I lead and some other teams in AUS, we've been working for a while to try to get this a lot more user-friendly, but the components are all still there. So if you can get to the website, you can filter by remote ID, you can search for a drone manufacturer broadcast module. You'll be able to find the information you need. It's just not as user-friendly as we'd like, but always check our website to ensure that you do have a legitimate remote ID compliant device. Once you do that, you will need to update your registration. So that is done normally through Drone Zone. And if you might have a paper registration drone or a Part 47 drone, that might be something we can talk about a little bit later, but most everyone is going to have a drone that's registered through Drone Zone. If you haven't gone into your registration lately, you'll notice something new. It's going to have remote ID information in there where you can put in a remote ID module, the serial number, and you can tie it to either a specific drone or drones in your inventory if you're a recreational flyer and you have more than one attached to the registration number. But that is a critical step in complying with remote ID. So wait a minute, after September 16th, if I have a compliant drone, but I haven't updated my registration, am I compliant with remote ID? You're not. You need to update your registration. So that's an important component to that. If you go to the website where you saw that video at the beginning, which I know we're going to post that website too, it has instructions to walk you through exactly how you update your registration to include your remote ID information. And there's not a $5 fee to do any registration updates. We've waived any of those fees, so you can update your drone registration at least through September 16th, probably a grace period after that as well. So if you haven't gone in there, take a look and make sure your registration is updated. Now, when we talk about recreational flyers, when we talk about registration, I mentioned that the one registration number for recreational flyers, this is the section 44809 crowd, applies to all the drones in your inventory. So you also need to list any standard remote ID drones or remote ID broadcast modules in your inventory. And the number attached to the broadcast module must be listed for each drone not equipped with standard remote ID. So if you've got a bunch of drones, they don't have standard remote ID, you need to make sure that your registration is updated with your broadcast module serial number. And this will allow you to then move that broadcast module physically around from drone to drone. If you're going to fly this drone today, you're going to fly a different drone another day. Under 44809, you can move that broadcast module around. As I mentioned before, under Part 107, a little bit different. That's the one-to-one. So you get one registration number. You're going to get one remote ID serial number attached to that registration, whether it's a standard remote ID or whether that's a broadcast module. And you can't switch between the two. You can't take one broadcast module and jump it around to a bunch of different drones in your different registrations, because again, it's a one-for-one thing. That one broadcast module needs to stay with that one drone as it's listed in your Part 107 registration. All right, what about transmitting? Who's going to pick this up? This is a hot topic. We get a lot of comments on it. There's a lot of online chatter about it. I see a lot in my inbox about this. But the point of remote ID is to broadcast information to help us keep our airspace safe and secure. So who's going to pick up that remote ID information? Really, anybody that's going to be within signal range and has that equipment. So the point of it being that if we need to distinguish between a compliant operator and a non-compliant operator, law enforcement gets involved, it assists in that process of keeping everything safe. Now, we at the FAA are not developing tools or solutions, at least in the foreseeable future, for receiving the broadcast module. This is going to be, or I should say the remote ID information. This is going to be an industry-driven type product, much like broadcast modules were, the standard remote ID equipment was. So as terms of what can I use to see a drone in flight, I don't have the answer, and there's probably a few out there that you can use already, but I would hesitate on recommending or not recommending any of them. But the point being is that the FAA will not be producing these apps or devices to pick up remote ID signals. We just require that the remote ID signals be broadcast on certain frequencies so that devices can receive that information. But the point again in all this is to help keep our airspace system safe and secure. Now, that being said, your personal information is not transmitted. Your name, your address, phone number, driver's license, any other information you might have put into your registration, that is not transmitted via remote ID. So when it comes to, well, how does that really work? There's an ID serial number attached to your remote ID equipment. That's the number that law enforcement or FAA personnel can track back to our system and provide that type of information to authorized parties. So your neighbor or some person driving down the street, they might be able to see your remote ID serial number if they've got the equipment, they're within range or everything, but they won't know who you are. They won't know your name. They won't know your address, nor will they be able to get that information. They won't be able to email the FAA or go to a website and say, I want to correlate this remote ID serial number to this individual. That's not going to happen. In the future states of remote ID, we're looking at creating something called session ID. I don't want to get too far into that right now, but it's really an alternate means for broadcasting remote ID information as a session ID rather than your remote ID serial number. But the result is still the same. It'll still transmit information. That information cannot be correlated to you or any of your personal information without proper authorization. So that's law enforcement, that's FAA personnel, kind of what we saw in that video when we started it out. All right, I promised we'd get to FRIAs. We're getting to FRIAs now. So what are we talking about here? Well, these are going to be locations where, as many of you probably know, you can operate drones that are not equipped with remote ID, whether that's a broadcast module or a standard remote ID drone as well. They can be located, I'm going to probably get hammered for saying this, just about anywhere, technically. Realistically, they're not going to be located just about anywhere. There's certain requirements that we need to look at the FAA side, where we look at these FRIA locations and we evaluate them before approving them. There are some requirements, though. If you're going to be operating in a FRIA, you have to be flying visual line of sight. BVLOS does not work if you're going to enjoy the benefits of a FRIA. Additionally, both the person flying the drone, i.e. the operator, and the drone itself must remain within the lateral boundaries of that FRIA. And I use the term lateral because if you think back, I mentioned two-dimensional location. FRIAs are two-dimensional locations. So we were talking lateral boundaries, physical locations on the ground. And again, they're valid for 48 calendar months. They're renewable, but that's where a lot of people are looking to, especially on this call, get established right now. So I'm going to do a little bit of focusing on this. But before we get into how did that application process work, where are we at, I want to clear something up because this is a huge source of confusion. Not saying for you folks here on the call, but just in general, even as some folks within the FAA. We have FRIAs and we have fixed sites, and they're two completely different things. And if you can remember anything from what I said in the last 10 minutes or what I'll say in the next 5 or 10 minutes, remember that FRIAs are not fixed flying sites, and fixed flying sites are not FRIAs. All right, now you can tune out, log out, because you heard really the most important piece of my whole show. But let's get into this a little bit more. So you can see on your screen some of the differences between the two. Mainly speaking, fixed flying sites exist for airspace authorization purposes. So that fixed flying site is in controlled airspace and it needs an FAA airspace authorization. And instead of requiring everybody flying there to get their own LANC authorization, there can be an agreement made with air traffic control to say, hey, if you stay within this 3-dimensional cylinder, if you will, most of them are round in shape, you do not need to submit individual LANC authorizations. You can just treat that as a standing airspace authorization, if you will. That's not what a FRIA is. So FRIAs, again, are two-dimensional. They are not airspace authorization related. They are equipment related. These are locations where certain equipment that normally you'd be required to have on board your drone is not going to be required there. So that is a key component. They're very, very different. And I've got some slides here. I think after this one, you're going to witness my PowerPoint design skills in full effect. So yeah, brace yourself. But when we're talking about FRIAs, we're talking about fixed sites. You can have a FRIA all on its own, just sitting out there in the countryside, all on its own. You can also have a fixed flying site all on its own, sitting somewhere within maybe 5 miles of another airport or some other controlled airspace. You can have that all on its own. And you can have both of them at the exact same location. So they can be combined with each other in terms of where they exist, but they are not combined in terms of what they do. FRIAs and fixed flying sites are separate. FRIA, equipment; fixed flying site, airspace authorization. Behold my PowerPoint design expertise. So I'm going to walk you through a few slides here, and then we'll pause for some questions. But as we go through the next slides, I want you to take a look at this beautiful PowerPoint design you see on your screen here. The red area, we're going to say for the purposes of the discussion, is locations where remote ID would be required, meaning almost all the United States is going to be in a red area. I mean, you're going to need to broadcast remote ID, because remember, remote ID is not tied to a location, it's tied to your drone and the registration requirements. So just about everywhere you have to have remote ID. I put a fixed flying site in green. So there's your 3-dimensional cylinder. And I put a FRIA location in, I don't know, purple, terrible colors, but purple, which as you can see underneath that green cylinder, you've got that purple ring kind of around those 2 remote controlled runways, if you will. So keep that in mind. You got the flying site, you got the remote ID requirement everywhere, and you've got the FRIA. So let's talk a little bit about how this works. So the first scenario here, you've got the operator and you've got the drone. So in this case, the operator is inside the FRIA area and the drone is inside the FRIA area and the flying site area. So in this situation, you would not need an individual airspace authorization because you're within that flying site. Your drone is within that flying site. And you would not need to have remote ID equipment on board because you and the drone are both within the lateral boundaries of that FRIA location. So you and the drone are both within the boundaries. Let's say you step outside the FRIA location, but your drone is still in there. Your drone is still, above the circle on the ground, if you will, that purple area. So you're outside the FRIA, your drone is inside the lateral boundaries of a FRIA and within that cylinder. So in this situation, airspace authorization would not be needed because your drone is within that green cylinder. But because you stepped out, because both you and your drone are not in that FRIA location, remote ID would be required, even though it looks like the drone is within, or I should say above, that 2-dimensional circle on the ground for your FRIA location. And of course, if we bring the drone outside and you stay outside, well, now the drone's outside the FRIA, the drone's outside the fixed flying site, you're outside the FRIA. So now you just need everything like you would be flying probably in your backyard if you needed an airspace authorization. You're going to need a LANC authorization to fly there. You're going to need a remote ID equipment on board that's broadcasting the required remote ID elements. So that's probably the best way I can walk through what the difference is between those two. So let's get into a little bit about the application process for a FRIA, because I know a lot of people have questions about that. So who can request a FRIA? Per the rule, FRIA applications are going to be limited to FAA recognized community-based organizations and educational institutions. Now, this is a little bit different than how the educational institutions are defined in 44809. And I want to point that out because it is a small difference. In 44809, currently, although I think they're looking at updating, mentions institutions of higher education and JROTC programs and things like that in order to be considered 44809. FRIA applications are educational institutions. So if you look at that sub-bullet, it includes a lot of different types of educational institutions, trade schools, colleges, primary, secondary schools, things like that. So if you fall in those definitions of educational institutions, you can apply for a FRIA. When you do, the FAAs can consider a bunch of things. I just highlighted some of the things here. They're going to take a look at the airspace surrounding the area you want to operate the FRIA. They're going to take a look at whether or not that FRIA would affect the safe or efficient use of that airspace by other aircraft, whether participating or not participating. Look at the people on the ground. What is the FRIA around? Does it encompass roads, buildings, other types of infrastructure, busy areas, things like that? How close is it to another FRIA? The whole intent of remote ID is not to establish FRIAs in everyone's backyard, because then why have remote ID, right? So how close are you to another FRIA? How realistic is it that you could get to a closer FRIA to do the same type of work you want to do? All of those things are part of the overall decision-making process when it goes into a FRIA application. So how do you apply? I can't stress this enough. Read the advisory circular, read 89-3 and read it again. It might take a couple times to read through it. We don't create advisory circulars to keep ourselves busy. They're actually very difficult to write. I've written one, I know, but please start there with that advisory circular and then go to the Drone Zone website, because the questions you're going to be asked, you're going to create your account, you're going to do all those things, adding a service, adding a FRIA service. You'll be much better positioned to have a successful application if you read through that advisory circular. Now, are we going to publish that FRIA for everyone to see? Yes. Yes, we will. They're going to go on our FAA's UAS data delivery service, the UDS website. This is what drives a lot of our UAS service suppliers and their maps, but you can get online, you can see it. The one I have on screen there, that's not a FRIA location, don't freak out. That's a fixed flying site, but I wanted to show you an example of, yes, we publish these on our UDDS website. But now what if that FRIA is on private location, private property? Do I have to give other people property access rights because my FRIA application was approved on my private land? No, you do not. So the FAA, by establishment of a FRIA or approving your FRIA, does not require you to grant the public access to your property. That's another question we see quite often. All right, so great, FAA. That sounds great, Kev. Thanks a lot, buddy. What's up with my FRIA application? Well, we're currently right around 14 applications approved. They are a mix of FAA-recognized CBOs and educational institution applications. We also have quite a few that were denied for a variety of reasons. Some of the most common ones you see on the screen there, that the boundaries encompassed public roads or public buildings or public parks, where that, again, the safety and security element of people on the ground come into play. So keep all that in mind when you're looking at establishing where that FRIA location would be. Don't ask for the moon, thinking that we're just going to scale it down for you. Ask for only what you need. The more precise you're asked, the more likely it is that we can review your application quickly. So you mentioned quickly, Kevin, how long does this take? It's an ongoing process. I don't want to quote a time because I don't want to be quoted on that later, because it's still ongoing. But the good news here is that the team that does these reviews, they're adding some additional personnel. They're looking at changing some of the processes. There's some things that we're making more efficient. So that should, in the next coming few weeks or maybe a month, that will shorten the process time down before that September 16th deadline. Keep fingers crossed. But if you do have specific inquiries, either about your application or something about the FRIA process, don't just write an angry post on Facebook or Twitter, or maybe Threads now if you're super cool. Use our email address, fria@faa.gov, and send your request there. They'll be better able to help you out, but please be patient. Give us a couple days at least to respond. You're probably not the only one who wants a FRIA. There's many applications we have and probably many questions right now. With that, that's the end of my deal. And I think what we'll do is we'll open up some questions. I don't know, Diana, if you want to come